Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. We are delighted to have you with us today for the third in a series of webinars on the topic of workforce reentry. This Forward to Work Perspectives to Guide Reentry series is hosted by United Minds, a global consultancy that supports organizations and their people through transformation in partnership with Weber Shandwick, Pal Tate, and Element Scientific Communications. My name is Sarah Clayton. I am an Executive Vice President with United Minds and will be moderating today's session and this series of webinars. If you've joined us in past weeks, you know that this conversation is framed by what we call the people imperative, or the mandate we believe that companies have to put their people first through the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. Our previous sessions have focused on helping companies to navigate government guidelines and understand the status of treatments and vaccines and the promise and limitations of workplace testing. This week, we turn our attention to understanding the more personal impacts of COVID-19, specifically the way it is affecting our mental health. Company closures, schedule changes, job losses, furloughs, and economic uncertainty have made anxiety a near universal emotion in today's environment. Combined with pressures on the home front, from caring for sick family members to homeschooling children, our resilience is being tested at every turn. How can employers rise to the occasion and support their people's emotional and psychological well-being, whether they're returning to work or continuing to work from home? Today, we have Dr. Leo Flanagan and Mary von Herrmann with us to share their thinking on this topic. Dr. Flanagan is the founder of the Center for Resilience and helps organizations and their people thrive in the midst of adversity. His work has included running a support group for first responders following 9/11, designing resilience training for families following Hurricane Sandy, and supporting the Newtown Police following the school shooting there in 2012. He regularly advises organizations on people and talent strategy, including the Bank of America, McDonald's, Home Depot, and others. Early in his career, Leo was a faculty member at Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations, and currently serves as faculty and executive coach for Carnegie Mellon's Executive Leadership Academy. Mary von Herrmann is an executive vice president with United Minds, focused on change management and learning and development. She maintains that leaders will need a new set of skills and behaviors as they bring people back to work, and has in recent weeks designed training to help people managers learn to manage themselves, their teams, and the business during these uncertain times. She works regularly with senior leaders as an executive coach and is an authority on leadership alignment, advising a global client base in the technology, pharmaceuticals, and finance sectors. Earlier in her career, Mary led learning and development and talent development at NBC Universal and was a change management consultant with Accenture. Before we begin, please note that given the large number of attendees, you will not be able to speak during today's session. So if you do have a comment or question, we'd encourage you to enter it into the Q&A field in Teams, and we'll try to address as many questions as possible during our last 15 minutes together. And with that, I will hand it to Mary.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome all of you. Leo and I are delighted to join this webinar today to kind of explore this very important and relevant topic that's facing all of us as we begin to look ahead to the reentry, the restarting, the new beginning that we are facing. So next slide. We are going to take this topic of employee resilience, which can be interpreted in many different ways, and we're going to take it and try to give you some pragmatic tools for you to take away from this session. And we'll start first by looking generally at the state of mental health during this COVID-19 era. And we'll then look a little bit more closely at understanding stress and anxiety and their impacts. And a large part of this session is going to be around building resiliency both for self and others. And as Sarah mentioned, we do have a belief that employers and managers and leaders are looking at a new landscape in terms of scope of their responsibility and scope of their efforts as they look at the well-being and caretaking of their employees. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about how employers can help. And as we will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time to discuss and talk through your questions. Next slide. So COVID-19 is an urgent global crisis. It kind of goes without saying. We've been living in this intense period for months now. The loss of life is hard to get your head around at times. I think we hit around 360,000 deaths at the global level. The US reported around 100,000 in the last week. The social disruption that we felt has been dramatic. Reports of increased psychological stress, anger, concern about future financial situation as well as mental health of family members is on the rise. And communities are struggling to manage the social distancing and the safety measures that have been put in place. Depending on the region that you're in, that has had a different intensity for different communities. Unemployment numbers are higher than we've seen in decades, and the economic impact is probably still unfolding. There's debate as to when this rebound might happen, but we know it's a crisis of enormous proportions and multiple dimensions, which is, I think, the reason that the anxiety topic is so relevant. We don't yet understand where we're going or when this will end. And so it serves us well to look deeply at what we can do to navigate this period. Next slide. So this pandemic has created a secondary pandemic, and Leo and I will talk quite a bit about this mental health crisis that we're seeing across communities, but also in organizations. Next slide. So here is a snapshot from a company, a global company that is a mid-sized organization and captures really this notion of how anxious and stressed employees are. And I'm sure for those of you looking at this word cloud, you recognize these emotions in yourselves, in your own employees. And I think what's interesting here is how wide the range is of emotions that all of us are experiencing. This was just a moment in time. It was taken last month. It's a snapshot of a day, a moment, but it's quite varied. And of course, the font size correlates to the frequency of response. So you can see some of those big emotions around anxiety or stress or feeling overwhelmed have come to the surface. But what's interesting is we also see frequent respondents around words like grateful and hopeful and empathetic. And as we look to this journey ahead and the return to work, both Leo and I want to explore the opportunity, the resilience opportunity that the emotional state provides. So the positive emotional state will give us some building blocks to create a more resilient personal experience, but also organizational experience. So next slide. So here is some data that is pretty extreme when you think about it. 7 out of 10 employees believe that this pandemic is the most stressful time of their career, even more so than September 11th or the 2008 Great Recession. And 88% of workers report experiencing moderate to extreme stress levels over the past 4 to 6 weeks. So again, probably not surprising, but it gives you a sense of the scale and the scope of the anxiety that employees are feeling. And what that means is that when they return to work in the ways that all companies are going to navigate that process, employers are going to have to step up. Next slide. And we read a lot, and I'm sure you and your organizations are busy planning workforce reentry logistics and operational processes. There's the physical and health and the well-being of our employees, and that is the right thing to do, and it will limit employers' risks ultimately. But if you look to the right on this slide, we are also in a period of expanding the scope of wellness oversight. And the way we see this is, in the past, companies 50 years ago were primarily focused on occupational wellness. And then over the last 20 years or so, there's physical, social, and intellectual wellness that have been taken into account. So things like gym memberships, or a foosball, or massage in the office, or indeed reimbursements for going back to university, and certainly social engagement like doing a charity run together. All of these things have become a corporate or business offering for employees. And what we're seeing in the COVID area is that there's now this third dimension on the right, and this is this notion of the emotional and the mental wellness of our employees. And we're realizing that there's a shift, not suggesting that your people need to be mental health experts, but it is likely that awareness of this topic and awareness for the stresses that people are bringing to work will become increasingly important as we move ahead. And that's really what we're going to drill down on today and give you some practical tips and ideas for how to consider those questions. Next slide.
Thanks, Mary, and thank you, Sarah. I'm delighted to be here. So let's talk about understanding anxiety and stress and how they impact us. Next slide, please. So stress is a demand that exceeds our natural regulatory capacity. So as Mary shared with us, you know, that cloud of emotions and feelings, all of us are going to react to this situation in very individual and unique ways. What's important for people to understand is all of those reactions are natural reactions to a very unnatural environment. And so the fact that you feel anxious is not a sign that there's anything wrong with you. It's a sign that all of our human abilities from a neurological standpoint are being overtaxed, right? But what we can do through building resilience at the individual and organizational level and making the changes that Mary and I will talk about is not only relieve that anxiety, but make people stronger going forward. Next slide, please. So this is a very kind of famous, for those of us in the craft of helping organizations and people change, kind of model, right? So, and from a Buddhist perspective, we are in the land of no longer and not yet. So we're in the neutral zone, although clearly it doesn't feel very neutral right now. Rather than neutral, it's like being in some kind of unbelievable storm with tremendous uncertainty. But at the same time, it is in this period when we'll find ways to create a new beginnings. And one of the things that I think is really, really important about United Minds' approach is it's about moving forward. It's not about returning. We're simply not going to return to the way that things were, and that creates some grief, but it also creates some huge opportunity. Not that anything that comes out of this will make it worth it, but there are opportunities we know from other disasters where good things can happen, and we need to make sure that we at least bring those forward. For example, I did work at Ground Zero in New York on 9/11 and afterwards. And at that point in our history, mental health was very rarely talked about. You know, especially amongst construction workers, first responders, it was just, you know, for other people. My experience after 9/11 was there was a sea change in that. And so I've now had the opportunity, as Sarah mentioned in the introduction, to work with hundreds of first responders from 9/11 who came forward and said, hey, I need help. I don't know what's happened to me. And just to help them understand that their reactions were natural really created a great relief for them. And also out of 9/11 were born many, many volunteer organizations that continue to serve the world. I was able to go to Hurricane Sandy response as a member of one of them, where first responders and construction workers and people of all backgrounds would come together to help rebuild these communities. I remember very clearly on the front porch of a woman's house that had just been flooded up to halfway up the second floor, and she slept through it. She was a rather older woman. But sitting on that front porch were a woman who was a physiologist from Columbia University and another woman who was an iron worker. And that's the level of people that we brought together. And again, not just for Hurricane Sandy, those people continue to go forward to Haiti and to other places here. In Hurricane Sandy was where we first put in place our resilience training programs that we'll hear more about in a bit. But we saw people make remarkable changes in their lives. We saw people who had been afraid, for instance, of going into Manhattan, just get themselves, more resilient, so they faced that challenge. Other people found new careers. The community that we spent most of our time in, Garrettson Beach, really came together as a group of 1,800 families who had lost, in most cases, their homes, their jobs, their cars, and they really came together. And that community continues to work to serve itself. So we don't want to lose the real potential coming out of this. And I'm not just hopeful, I'm certain that there will be new beginnings coming out of this that will serve us very, very well. Next slide, please. So resilience is the ability to thrive amidst anxiety and stress. So many of us are familiar with coping mechanisms, and coping mechanisms are fine if you're living through this kind of limited stressor, this limited challenge, this limited period of anxiety. It doesn't really serve us well when we're in this prolonged state, and as Mary said, with so many dimensions. But we want you to understand that everything we talk about in terms of resilience is not just good ideas, it is based on hard neuroscience. The science proves that if you perform certain behaviors over time, you will be able to thrive, as hard as that may seem, in this environment, and as importantly, going forward. Next slide, please. So one of the things that has changed pretty dramatically is when I went to graduate school, the idea was that the brain formed, and when you were somewhere about 5 years of age, that was it. You were done. We were totally wrong about that. And that's really great news, because the human brain continually, literally rewires itself. Now, we as people, we as leaders, we as community members, we need to understand that the brain is going to rewire itself one way or another. So we're going to allow this to happen to us, and our brain will rewire itself to be more anxious, not so good. Or we can take control and we can guide the rewiring of our brains and our communities and our employees and our customers. On the right-hand part of this slide, there is this thin kind of thing with a root, right? That's a single brain neuron, right? What's kind of interesting for me is in the few minutes that Sarah, Mary, and I have been talking to you, each of your brains has created hundreds of thousands of new roots, if you will. And as we go through this hour, that process will continue. And then the brain, over a pretty short period of time, will say, well, is Leo going to use that new set of connections? And if Leo doesn't use them, the brain just automatically deletes them, pairs them away. But if, when Mary talks about empathy, you decide that you're going to practice her set of behaviors that makes you more empathetic and allows you to help others, then your brain is going to insulate the neural connections that allow you to be empathetic. And this right-hand part of the slide that looks like hot dogs along that route is something called myelin. And so the brain will protect those. And so right now, whatever your anxious and stress responses are can be replaced by responses that make you more empathetic, that make you more calm. And so that's the opportunity here. Next slide, please. Right. So the brain's really complex. I'm going to try and make this easy because I get lost sometimes. There's two pictures of the brain here. At the top, there's something called the amygdala. The amygdala is at the back of your head, your skull, at the top of the spine. It's kind of buried deep in there. It's an ancient part of the human brain, and it's only got one function. to protect you. But the only way it protects you is when it senses a threat, it pumps cortisol and a tremendous number of other chemicals and hormones through your body that alerts the entire body. And it's designed to allow you to flee a fear, a threat, or fight it. That's no longer functional, especially when we're in lockdown mode or trying to be calm as we go about. But when you feel this wave of emotion, that's what's happening. The amygdala part of the brain is triggering and taking everything over. Now, the lower brain has something called the PVC, prefrontal cortex. That part of the brain is the thinking part of the brain. And what resilience does is allow you to physically and physiologically develop that front part of your brain. So when you see something that provokes anxiety, you say, wait a minute, let me take a deep breath. Let me remain in control. And you counter the amygdala. And over time, practicing the behaviors that Mary and I will talk about and bringing those behaviors into your organizations will allow people to go forward in this very, very uncertain environment with confidence, calmness, and the ability to manage rather than be impacted. Next slide, please. So all of our work, again, is based on neuroscience. We built our resilience model based on what's called a meta-analysis, which is bringing together all the relevant research from around the globe. For people like me, it's kind of fun to do. For most people, it'd probably be incredibly boring. But the net is, we have, again, scientifically proven 10 sets of behaviors that make you more resilient. Now, the really good news is you don't need all 10, right? And so in this circumstance, on the top row, you'll see 3 organized: focus, pragmatic optimism, and empathy. And in this environment, if you had to make a choice, and you do because you want to practice these behaviors routinely and consistently, that's where you should start, right? Those give you the best kind of beginning foundation of taking control of and reducing your anxiety. And then on the right-hand side are 2 more: fact-based decision-making and agility. Today, Mary and I are going to talk to you about how to create focus, pragmatic optimism, and empathy. We won't have time to get to fact-based decision-making and agility. But those are the next 2 we would add on to our repertoire as we go forward. Next slide. Okay, a deeper dive into focus. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a combination of scheduling aspects of how to get the most out of your day. And again, it's based on neuroscience. It's not like Leo said, this is a good idea. So a lot of us come from a place where we used to say, I'm a night person, I'm most productive then, I'm an evening, I'm a morning, I'm an afternoon person. Okay, that's all gone. That's all gone because pre-COVID, we were so bombarded by information during the day that if we didn't get high priority work done in the very early part of the day, the chances of getting it done with high quality were diminished. So the advice is, after you wake up and get set for the day and have done some meditation, some other stress management to lower your baseline, then you want to take your first 55 minutes and work on your most important priority for that day. At the end of 55 minutes, you want to stop, right? Because the research also shows you go past 55 minutes of concentrated effort, your energy, your quality all goes down. And you want to take 10 minutes to spend on non-work. Non-work is not doing work email. Since we're working at home, non-work is playing with my new kittens. Non-work is Facebooking my grandchild. Non-work is reading a book to kids at the child care center who are now on distance learning, right? Non-work is non-work, okay, guys? The other thing is you don't check your email and text until after that first 55 minutes, because every time you take a text or an email, you're switching, you're multitasking, and that alone can drop your productivity for the day by 60%. So again, I want to be very clear. This is very specific information because the research is so solid. Now let's talk about working with others, okay? Right now, we're all trying to figure out how to do this distance working, and right now, many of us are trying to figure out how do we come back together physically in the same location to work in very different ways, right? So to make things more efficient and to give us a sense of clarity and control, 2 of the things we really need to get through this, we recommend holding 3 huddles a day. What's a huddle? Huddle's very simple. The leader, the manager, says after they've done their 55 minutes, after they've done 10 minutes of non-work, let's get together either virtually or observing distance and mask protocols, in the location, be it the office, be it the restaurant, whatever it may be, and let's just have a quick conversation. In the old days, we used to recommend you stand up so you keep the thought of getting done fast, but the leader gives a briefing on what's new, right? Very, very important for us to be able to tell our people what's new, particularly around things that I'm used to when I went back to work that aren't there anymore. So very important in disasters to let people know when restaurants go back online, when coffee shops open up, so that people know what resources there are for just having a bit of normal life, if you will. The second part of a huddle is people say to the leader, hey, this is what I'm working on today, this is what I need, and the leader says, yes, I can get that for you, I'm not sure I'll do my best, or sorry, that's not going to happen. Again, clarity. And then that's the end of the huddle. The next huddle is somewhere in the middle of the day, and the third huddle is the end of the day. Same protocol. Here's the rule. I'm there for you as the leader for 10 or 15 minutes, and whatever issue you have you want to bring up, that's what we're here for. But after that huddle, I'm going to work on high priority work. You're going to work on high priority work. So if you don't make the huddle, you'll understand that I'll next be available for you at the next huddle, right? And that sounds kind of harsh, but what you'll find is people learn to solve problems, to be empowered. And I don't have any data at my hands right now, but my guess is people are going to feel less empowered as we go back to work because it's going to be such a strange environment. This will allow people to feel like, okay, I got to get this done. The supportive deferral, right? So there's people that, most people, quite honestly, when there's new rules, they naturally challenge them, sometimes in a humorous way, sometimes not so much. So if you decide to go along with the huddles, you're going to find people who show up 2 minutes after the huddle, and sometimes that'll be intentional because people don't like change, and so let's see if we can defeat this huddle thing. So you can say, okay, I'll talk to you now, even though you didn't follow the rules. Or you can say, hey, Leo, I understand what you want to talk to me about is very important. It deserves 100% of my attention. Right now, I'm working on something also important, and honestly, if I talk to you now, I'd be so distracted, you wouldn't have 100% of my attention. But if you come back at 10 o'clock or next huddle, I promise you I'll give you 100% of my attention. Now, the person's got two choices. To insist on talking with you, which means they're telling you and themselves it's really not that important because I can talk to you when you can't give me your full attention. So over time, people learn to follow the huddle structure, unless, of course, there's a real urgent situation. Another concept is, so all of us have hopefully smaller crises than the pandemic and the economic disruption all day long. We don't know when they're going to happen. I was very fortunate. United Minds technologist Joel helped me figure out how to get online this morning. It took about an hour. I don't think he had that in his day. I didn't have it in mine, but that's what happens, right? So one way to handle it is that's just life and we kind of roll with it. And then things fall off the plate. The way to handle it is schedule 3 2-hour periods a week and don't allow anybody to book anything in there. So when something happens and you're working with a team or you can't make a meeting, you don't say, hey guys, we'll have to get back together someday. You say, folks, this afternoon, Friday, I have a 2-hour window from 3 to 5. I can't work with you now, I'm working with Joel. 3 o'clock, let's get back together. So right away there's a solution, and you're not working till midnight or 1 a.m. because you're trying to catch up with the day's work. So a really practical way. You don't have to know when the times are going to occur, or excuse me, the crises, because you have these open blocks. And the last one is the other part of focus, the meditation part. Meditation is a very, very powerful way of increasing your ability to focus, to gain control of your body's response to stress, to think more clearly. It's got huge benefits emotionally and physically. So we strongly recommend that as an individual and as a leader, you build in meditation practices throughout the day. Next slide, please. Pragmatic optimism, our second set of behaviors to build resilience. So what is pragmatic optimism? It is the knowledge, not the belief, the knowledge that this will end. We will get through this. There is no dispute about that. The only conversation we're having is how soon and when. We will get through this as a global society. And we will get through this in part because of decisions each one of us to make each day a little bit better for ourselves and others. We will be part of the solution. Next slide, please. So I'm going to ask you to use your Q&A function, if you would please, and answer this very simple question. What are you grateful for today? Just whatever it is, whatever you experienced today. I'm clearly grateful for Joel, right? Otherwise I wouldn't be with you. Looking. Okay, so we've got some people who are happy because I'm not sure where they are, but it's a sunny day. We've got some people happy because they made a deadline. We've got some people who I spent time with my family. We've got several of those. Great. I'm grateful to have a job. My family's health and active jobs. The ability to connect with everyone virtually. Okay, terrific. Thank you, folks. Next slide, please. So what I really hope you'll do tonight is take some kind of paper and a writing implement, not your iPhone, please, and write down what you just did. What are 5 things that went well during the day? Remember that amygdala thing? When you start to go to sleep at night, the amygdala starts to say, oh, Mary, you can't sleep, Mary. I don't think you read that email that you sent out at 8:30 this morning. You shouldn't go to sleep until you figure that one out. Oh, Mary, I don't think you've spent quite enough time getting ready for that meeting next Thursday, right? So the amygdala gets us worried about things that the amygdala determines as stressors and threats. Now, one of the most important things that your brain does when you sleep soundly is detoxify. You can think about brain, which is burning calories, creating almost a dust or a sludge. When you sleep well, that gets cleaned out and you wake up refreshed. When the amygdala is firing away, you don't sleep well and you wake up feeling sluggish and a little bit down. When you write the 5 things that went well, you counter the amygdala. And that's what you're thinking about as you go to sleep. You'll go to sleep faster, you'll sleep more soundly, and you'll wake up feeling refreshed. You have to do that every night for about 4 or 5 days to go get those effects. But again, this is not like a good idea. This is based on hard neuroscience. May I have the next slide, please? So, a very common set of emotional reactions when we face new stresses, right? And it seems like we're facing new stresses all the time as we go through this zone of no longer but not arriving at what's going to be the future. And one of these, to me, it's like being in the ocean during a really rough surf time, right? So there's this surge of, this is going to last forever. I don't see a way out, right? If you've ever been caught in the surf, sometimes you feel that way. You can't get your breath. You're kind of stuck underwater, right? The second thing is, I will lose everything. Everything is going to go away. And the third thing is, I'm powerless. There's nothing I can do. And these emotions don't always happen in that same way. Often they are so quick that you feel them all at once, and then your brain, in an effort to cope with it, highlights 1 out of the 3, right? But this is the normal, natural reaction. I shouldn't have said normal, but the natural reaction to a very unusual situation where we're feeling out of control and uncertain. Next slide, please. If we simply ask and answer these 3 questions consistently whenever we have any stressor, we will rewire the brain to counter those emotional waves with a thought process that keeps us calm and allows us to move forward and make decisions. Will this last forever? No. Right? If you have trouble with that answer when you're doing this yourself, you need to go and look at hard facts. Look at trusted resources so you know that this is the truth. Does this impact everything that's important to me? Well, obviously, it impacts an awful lot of what's important to all of us. At the same time, we're finding that kind of counterintuitively, that distance and technology, which before were making us feel very alone and stressed before the crisis, now platforms like this and sessions like this and Zooming with family members, social relationships, family relationships are becoming stronger. Communities are forming in different ways. And I think, right, this is my opinion because I don't have the data, that's happening because we're not just texting and emailing, we're seeing and talking with each other. Again, we're going to see good things come out of this terrible situation. And how can I use my skills, talents, and experience to make this better? Part of my role is I'm a clinician, and I spend a reasonable amount of time with 16 and 17-year-olds, right? And, you know, aside from this terrible situation, that's a tough time of life, and they face many challenges. But even when I ask them these questions, that third question, even at that early age, they can point to challenges they've overcome in their life. They can point to the fact that they didn't have the best family life, but somehow they got through it. One young man, really no family support, figured out how to get a scholarship to a private high school, and then figured out how to get a scholarship to a college, and figured out how to study while he went through all that in a family that wasn't really that loving and supportive. So every one of us has those skills that we can apply in this situation. And when you practice this over and over again, those waves calm down and you step forward with confidence and clarity. Next slide, please. Now over to Mary for building empathy.
Thanks, Leo. So the last behavior we're going to look at, and again, this is part of building resilience, is this notion of building empathy. And if we think about what Leo has taken us through, a lot of those initial focus and pragmatic optimism skills apply to all of us. This building empathy topic is really useful for those of you thinking about equipping your managers and leaders in this next phase. So how can we impart the building blocks of empathy in a way that really helps managers on the ground? So next slide. So we start this section with just a glance at all the different responses that I'm sure you're seeing with your organizations and teams. And this is kind of an extension of that emotions cloud, but it really shows the range of feelings about this next phase. Some people can't wait to get back to work and have that social fabric again. And some of our clients are reporting that their employees don't want to go back, or they want to go back, but family members are very concerned about the commute or about exposure in the work environment. So lots of interesting responses, and all of this is coming back with us as we re-enter and think about this next chapter at work. Next slide. And that's going to land on the desk of managers, right? So part of what we believe is so important is looking at each of your employees as individuals. So if you have a team or you have a division, beginning to unpack the individual experience that they've had through this crisis, and developing skills around empathy are one thing that will help enormously. So managers really have kind of 4 elements that they can choose from. One is the importance of reaching out, and as much as it's great to be on Zoom calls and group gatherings, there is an increased need for one-on-one communication, for meaningful connection, to understand what is going on in the story for this particular employee. So we're working with clients who might do that in a kind of status weekly update way to shift a bit to a deeper conversation. And part of what makes that work is managers and leaders' ability to work with open questions versus closed questions. So this is really a very nuanced shift that can open a much more powerful conversation. So instead of saying, "Are you doing okay?" how was your weekend? A question that elicits a yes or no response. It's supportive and well-intentioned, but empathy can be displayed by also going deeper in questions like, so tell me how you recharged this weekend, or tell me a little bit more about what's going on for your mom who's in a nursing facility. And again, this is all about creating space for your employees to share perspective and help you understand what support they need. Listening, a basic skill in almost every situation, becomes extremely important as we're exercising greater empathy, and to listen with curiosity and with a learning mindset, and opening yourself to this notion of, I know what my situation here is in my home, but what is really happening for my employee? And finally, this skill of co-creating solutions. And what we mean by that is this increased effort to look to your teams to kind of crowdsource ways of working solutions or client interaction solutions. It is a way, and Leo mentioned this earlier, to also give back control, so that employees who are part of solving some of the challenges that they're experiencing are gaining back some control that is such a big driver for anxiety and stress. So next slide. So just to pause for a moment on this skill of listening, we know that listening takes effort in general, and in this period even more so. And I've shared two numbers on the screen, 125 and 500. So what do those mean? 125 reflects the number of words per minute that the average person can speak. Now, if you're from New York, that number might be a little bit higher, but on average, that's a minute of words. And 500 represents the number of words per minute that the brain can process. So if you think about that, what are the implications for listening and indeed extending empathy? Well, when I'm listening to you, I have the capability to process 4 times faster than you can speak. And I'm sure you know the situation of people who are getting ahead of you or quickly are filling in the rest of your sentence because their brains are operating that much more quickly. And in this situation where we are merging work and home life in such an intense fashion, this situation gets amplified. And I know you've experienced it given the work from home status for most of us in the last few months. I have a coaching client who's working on this, and when he sits in a meeting, his tendency is to finish someone's sentence or to excitedly support someone by building on what they're saying almost before they get their idea out. And part of his practice is to quiet his mind, to take that 500 number and try to reduce it. And some of the practices that Leo presented are spot on to really help you quiet yourself to listen in a more meaningful way. Next slide. And the final thought on empathy is that people feel empathy in the how you communicate. And by that I mean your voice, which is really a primary tool in this remote environment, conveys empathy in ways that may be out of your awareness. So think about your pace and the importance of creating space for the other person to bring themselves into the conversation. So for you on the line who are managing or leading teams, how able are you to create that space, slow things down enough for the other person to bring their story to you? Use a warmer tone and think about bridge language. The opportunity to lift some language from someone on your team is another way to express that you're listening and to show an empathetic response. So we're hearing a lot about the necessity for leaders to show up with more empathy and to lead with empathy. And some of these small techniques can give you some pragmatic tools to do just that. Next slide. So we've talked about 3 quick tools building blocks for expanding resilience. How can employers help, and what is the role of employers in all of this? Next slide. So we mentioned this slide earlier, that dimensions of wellness may well be expanding. And without giving every one of you on the line a prescriptive solution, we suggest that questions are now posed. How much emotional and mental support will we give, and in what way? So the conversation needs to be part of the fabric for organizations in order to figure out the right balance for your sector and your region. Next slide. And HR and communications have key roles to play, though the responsibility for this rests broadly. For HR, there may be some changes in approach in terms of offering training around leadership, resilience, some of the topics we've talked about today. Policy and process changes may be coming, and you have already started putting some of those into place. But this balance is really at the center of these discussions, which is, what are the operational and safety guidelines? How am I going to get people up and down an elevator, balanced with the human process and the need for people to be able to share their anxiety and regulate it with their supervisor or colleagues. And for communications folks, the mantra continues to draw from trusted resources as an absolute best practice, and to increase leadership visibility. So we know that companies doing this well have their leaders out in front many times a week, and having a predictable cadence for that is very helpful. Even if there's nothing new to share, that provides that structure that employees are so looking for in this very chaotic and unstructured time. Importance of mental health can be emphasized in communications, and really being mindful of this hybrid workforce that awaits us. We know that companies are tackling this return to the office question in very different ways. They're unfolding as we go along, but communications professionals need to begin to think about engagement across multiple facilities, people at home, people at work, and perhaps an ever-changing location that some companies are choosing, where a team A and a team B swap out over the course of several months. Next slide. And so what does all that mean for an organization? This is an iceberg, and the iceberg represents kind of our emotional and psychological and behavioral selves. And we share this at the end of this discussion as a reminder for the fact that we are really dealing with a lot of activity below the waterline. So the emotions, the fears, the hopes, the anxieties, concerns we might have, those things are quite amplified in this period. And yet above the waterline are the things that we typically bring to work, right? So we focus on work and our deliverables. We look at each other's working styles or behaviors, and those are typically the things that we see and operate with at work. And so this new era, as we begin the journey towards work, implies that we as people managers need to focus both above the waterline and build the business and continue to serve clients with a heightened awareness for what's going on below the waterline. Next slide. And how can you get below the waterline? So if you're a people manager, how do you actually do that? Deepen your relationships, strengthen those connections so that your team feels more trust and more willingness to share. Show up more as a coach and less as a manager. So that notion of asking more than you tell, so that you're trying to understand where they are coming from. Stay compassionate, and remember that as businesses open and we all kind of meet and greet in the public space more, be it a workplace or in cities, we each have our own story that we're bringing to this engagement. And know your resources. You know, we started at the top of the hour saying there's not an expectation of your managers to become mental health professionals, but we are counseling clients to make sure that they know the resources available so they can help someone and supervise that support system if needed. Next slide.
So thank you, Mary. That was great. So I want to kind of wrap up here with the impact of building a more resilient person for yourself and a business, right? And so what are the outcomes of becoming more resilient at three levels, if you will: individually, business, and community? So I'm going to focus on right now what is most important to me, which is physical well-being and positive emotions or emotional well-being. Both of those rise 30%. And again, this is not just one study. This is many, many studies that continually find that level of improvement. Just think for a minute. If you felt physically better by 30% and emotionally better by 30%, what would your day be like? And then at the top of this, 17% more productive. I want to be really clear. 17% more productive without working longer hours. Especially in this environment, we're going to have to be more productive with fewer hours. Better decision making, right? At work, at home, in community, in family. 60% fewer errors. Critical here, where missteps are so costly because it's so difficult to unwind things. More proactive, right? It is really difficult to see around the corner in this environment, but also really important that we're able to anticipate some of the things that may or may not arrive and have contingency plans as individuals, as families, as teams, as businesses. Decrease in reactivity, right? So one of the things that's making us so anxious is this constant reaction to upsetting news, and some news is just confusing, right? Imagine that quelling. And 20%, 27% increase in self-awareness. So Mary just talked about a very new definition of what it's going to be a leader of people. And self-awareness, to make that change, is going to be absolutely critical. I also want to tell you that for executive teams, being resilient can increase your speed of decision-making by 50%. It can increase your revenues by 20%. And those two figures are across 119 companies we looked at. And finally, before COVID, the World Health Organization had declared stress as the epidemic of the 24th century. Unfortunately, they were wrong, but we need to understand that. And we need to understand that even in the old world, when we reduced people's stress level and made them more resilient, your ROI for every dollar spent in that would be 200 to 300%. And that's based on modeling coming out of Stanford University and Stanford Medical Center. So again, hard research proving that this brings hard dollars. Next slide, please. So some key takeaways. Anxiety and stress are natural reactions. If you had an underlying or a pre-existing challenge with depression or anxiety or any kind of emotional or cognitive challenge, by all means, continue to get the help you need. And understand that you have an overlay of the anxiety and stress in this environment. If anxiety is new to you, then understand it is that natural reaction. And Mary and I have given you at least a beginning understanding of how you can take control of that. Employers, you've really, to me, the iceberg, another water analogy, the seas are so rough, is flipped upside down. And if we don't deal with under the surface issues, we're going to find it very, very difficult for employees to come back to work and not be anxious. And if they're anxious, they're going to make your customers anxious. And anxious customers and consumers don't come out to do business. Build your own resiliency before you can help others. We were talking before this call about IBM and IBM's pledge. And one of the things that came out of, as Mary talked about, crowdsourcing was, I pledge to take care of myself. Really, really important. A core set of skills can go a long way. Yeah, there's 10 ways to build resilience, and Mary and I and United Minds know 100 different ways to align organizations. You don't have to know all of them. Just use a few and use them consistently. And as I just said, a resilient workforce produces better business outcomes. And by the way, all those benefits will far outlast this really uncertain time. We are going to get through this, and addressing the disease now will make us stronger going forward. Next slide. So resources. National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 24/7 in the U.S. Every nation that I know of has some similar resource. Know it for your area. A word. So I know that many of us are worried about, well, how do I know if somebody needs professional help? The answer is, if you're a layperson, you don't. So if somebody says, I really don't know what to do, I really can't take this anymore, I'm thinking of hurting myself, it's not your job to think about whether that's a true risk or not. It's your job to say, you need to get help right now, and you can either call a number like this, or we could take you to the local emergency department. But you need help right now. And if worse comes to worse, you need to call 911 in the US and ask first responders to come and help the person. Worst case scenario, you're wrong, but you've surfaced that it's okay to have that kind of challenge in the workplace, and you're doing it with empathy, as Mary talked about, and the person will benefit from it. It's not your job to make those kinds of judgment calls. Other resources, trusted resources, American Psychological Association, SAMHSA, National Institute of Mental Health, these all have resources, information. I want to talk about self-help apps. Those are becoming more and more sophisticated. This is a personal preference. I don't have science saying it's better than anybody else, but I happen to be somebody who uses 10% happiness. I'm also mentioning that so that you see that Mary and I and Sarah don't just talk the talk. We do this, right? We use these practices. I went to sleep last night using 10% happier. I woke up this morning using 10% happier. And trust me, I'm not getting any commercial benefit from this. Know what these resources available. Know what your EAP has available. Know what preventative steps can be taken in the workplace. Next slide.
All right. Well, we want to thank Leo and Mary for that terrific content. I think this topic in particular is not only relevant to many of us professionally, but is useful from a personal perspective as well. I think a lot of us can apply this as we try and take care of ourselves. I know we are at time, and we didn't get to Q&A, so our presenters have kindly agreed to stay on for another 10 minutes to take some of the questions that were submitted over the last hour. If you need to drop, please feel free. We will not be offended. We know you need to go on with your day. But if you would like to stay on for the Q&A discussion, we'll plan to do that between now and 1:10 Eastern. So as I look at some of the questions here, Leo and Mary, one of them is around getting leaders to understand the importance of mental health. We all know the importance of sponsorship from the top on any undertaking that we may pursue. And they're specifically asking, how can you scale this across an organization and ensure that everyone is on the same page so that leaders not only respect if an individual is trying to practice these tips, but that they themselves are doing it too? Mary, go ahead.
So as Mary said, we don't expect people to be mental health professionals. We do have the ability to equip people to improve their own anxiety management, to build their own resilience. And you can do that by providing online training. You can do that by providing town halls, although it's about repetitive behavior, so something that communicates it for a period of time. It's absolutely essential, and I've learned this through all disasters. Leaders need to stand up and not just say, take care of yourself, but to say, I'm taking care of myself. I felt troubled, I reached out. I can't tell you what a huge difference that makes to a workforce, to hear a respected leader say, hey, I not only get it, I went and got help for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just add to that, Leo, that I think as in any change or transformation effort, the sponsorship at the top is always the most important and often the hardest thing to secure, as those of you who have gone through these things know very well. But as much as we can get the sponsorship at senior levels to, as Leo said, admit and take on some of these behaviors, but really make it a business priority. I don't know if you saw, but IBM announced at the beginning of this month that the CEO wrote a work from home pledge that he was going to honor some of the requirements and needs of his employees. And I believe he generated it internally with kind of a bottoms up approach using input from employees who were struggling. And then he published it on LinkedIn. And it really shows this voice of sponsorship for this. And it's pledging things like, you know, you don't have to turn on your camera if you're not ready. It's okay if you have a child on your lap during a call. And the pledge you can read online in more detail, but I do think that's an example of that sponsorship. And the minute that is so clear, it sets priorities for business leads.
Absolutely.
Thank you both. So we did also get a number of questions around the recommendation that employers offer resilience training. And I'll just lump a few of these together. Someone mentioned that the CDC has recommended that employers train their employees on safety practices around reentry, and they're wondering if some type of resiliency training should be added on to that, or whether it should be managed separately. And then someone else asked about this notion of making the resiliency training mandatory. And they said that in their organization, people naturally resist this topic. And so sometimes it's hard to make it mandatory, and it goes over better when it's optional. But would welcome your thoughts on that. And Mary, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a natural addition to the CDC recommendation for safety, because I do think getting to this theme that we've talked about of psychological well-being and mental health well-being, they kind of belong together. So as you're laying out new safety regulations and arrows on the floor and how we're all going to operate in the coffee area, it's naturally going to bring up emotional responses. So to me, it seems like that's a great bolt-on, not an either or, but an addition. And in terms of requirements to take these trainings, I completely relate to resistance from employees to do mandatory training, and it can sometimes devalue it because it's pushed on them. I think it's always helpful to talk about the business benefits and again, have influencers at the leadership level or even at the peer level endorse it as not just soft, but actually extremely helpful in this period. And Leo, maybe you'd add to that in terms of.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Mandatory just makes me want to like not do it. So finding your informal leaders, the people at the top doing it, and again, talking about what they did. And I also want to say the reason you should bulk on resilience training is because people can't follow the safety precautions if they're too anxious. I'll give you a very quick example. You go to the grocery store and you see people running around very fast, not noticing what they're doing, and you think they're being rude, they're not being cautious. They're frightened. They want to get in and out as fast as possible. And in that state, they can't think about, am I 6 feet away from the next person? Is my mask on right? Well, when people go back to work, you're going to face the same thing. If they're too anxious, they're not going to figure out, oh, what's it like to serve meals with paper menus and plastic utensils in a steakhouse? Right? That's not an easy thing, right? You have to get the anxiety under control so people can attend to doing their jobs in a very new way.
Thank you both. You know, I want to just shift for a minute and talk about something that we didn't touch on in depth during the presentation, which is employee assistance programs, also known as EAPs. And I think the audience is wondering how they should be thinking about using EAPs in this time and what these programs typically offer. Leo, do you want to take that one?
Sure, thank you. Really great question, okay? Like any resource, EAPs have limited capacity, and they've tried to stretch that in this environment, but there is a limit. EAPs are designed for people that have substance abuse problems, that have personal crises that may involve legal matters. It depends on the scope of a company's particular EAP. But again, we need to understand that the vast majority of employees' anxiety is a natural reaction to an unpredictable, seemingly uncontrollable environment. So another reason why you want to provide resilience training is first of all, going to an EAP requires acknowledging that I have a problem that is mine that I need help fixing, okay? And that's something we as a society need to encourage and support. But we also need to provide the vast majority of employees with the resources to manage their anxiety, become more resilient, be more productive in this environment, so we don't overwhelm the EAPs. The EAPs need to be there to serve the people who need it. So it's a resource that you have to understand, you have to use, and you also have to, at the one time, encourage people to access it, and at the same time, try and give them tools voluntarily so they don't need to go there.
Thank you, Leo. We have time, I think, for one or two more. I want to get to this one. It's focused on the professional services industry. And really the question is, how do we take some of these tips and activities that you all have shared today and make them relevant in an environment where not everyone is sitting outside of their team leader's door? So just specifically, this individual is saying, my employees are not co-located. Many of them are going to be embedded or re-embedded on client sites, which we know is typical in consulting models. And, I'd love any suggestions on how to bring some of these activities to them, knowing that we're often meeting virtually or remotely. Mary, do you want to take that one?
Yep. So having been at Accenture and other professional services firms, I know that situation very well that you're describing, of kind of having a mothership with the company, but really spending enormous amount of time embedded with clients, and sometimes for years on end, that you're really more a part of that organization. And I guess I would say that the pragmatic nature of some of these things, and again, I think we've only just touched the surface today, lends itself to being practiced in any kind of environment. And I would argue that our comfort with the video Zooming and Teams interfaces have created an intimacy that I just have never done this much video conferencing since before COVID. And it is surprising over time how much you feel like you're in the same room. So I would encourage anyone in professional services to use these tools. And I guess in perhaps another perspective is also to consider using some of these tools in partnership with clients. And I know that it doesn't always work, and not every client is open to seeing consultants that way, but it is a powerful value add if you are also helping your clients understand some of the struggles of resilience and the struggles of anxiety, and the way that the client and the consulting teams work together. I can see a lot of applications for combined practice or combined discussions or forums or huddles or any of these things that we've been talking about that actually helps you in professional services add increased value to your client engagements.
All right, thank you, Mary. So we are 10 minutes past the hour. We're going to go ahead and wrap. But again, I want to thank both of you for being here with us today. And we hope all of you who were able to hang on enjoy the Q&A and the content that was presented. We, of course, will, if you advance the slide, we'll, of course, continue the series next week. And our topic is preparing leaders and managers. We'll get more specific, go beyond resilience to think about some of the ways that we can be equipping leaders and managers through reentry and beyond to better help their people through this. It's next Friday, June 5th, 12 p.m. Eastern per usual, and you can register or have friends or colleagues register at unitedmindsglobal.com. Thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great weekend.